Your life could be different, but there is something even more fundamental that Rudolf Steiner would reveal about this same central question, something related not merely to identifying specific patterns of self-destructive behavior, but to that very hidden and deeply subtle mechanism through which human consciousness could, in a truly sophisticated way, hide from itself exactly that which it would most urgently need to recognize in order to achieve genuine spiritual transformation. Steiner would explain that this specific mechanism of inner concealment would work through that same tripartite structure of the human soul already articulated extensively through his anthroposophic spiritual science, involving complex interplay between that thinking, feeling, and willing that would constitute fundamental dimensions of all human psychological experience, each of these specific dimensions developing, independently but interconnectedly, its own particular and subtle method of karmic concealment. The dimension of thinking, the first of these three fundamental faculties, would hide specific karmic truth through that mechanism that Steiner would call sophisticated rationalization, a process where the human mind would develop, with truly impressive creativity, logical and apparently convincing explanations to justify specific self-sabotaging behavior, thus creating an intellectual protective layer that would prevent conscious recognition of the true underlying karmic motivation operating far beyond that rational surface being presented. Steiner would also discuss how that same sophisticated rationalization would operate through specific and identifiable linguistic patterns, including that characteristic tendency to use words such as necessary, logical, or realistic precisely in those moments where a specific person would actually be justifying a clearly self-sabotaging decision through apparently neutral and objective language, suggesting that the development of increased sensitivity to recognize such a specific linguistic pattern in one's own inner speech would represent the first important diagnostic tool for identifying when that karmic rationalization would be effectively operating. The dimension of feeling, the second fundamental faculty being considered, would hide specific karmic truth through that distinct mechanism that Steiner would call selective emotional anesthesia, a process where a specific person would develop a remarkable capacity to intensely feel certain emotions while remaining completely disconnected and insensitive to precisely those emotions most directly related to the karmic material being avoided, thus creating sophisticated illusion about rich general emotional life, while the specific area would remain carefully protected through the same selective anesthesia being described. Steiner would also explore how that selective emotional anesthesia would manifest itself through that characteristic pattern where a specific person would report feeling simply neutral or indifferent precisely to situations that, according to any reasonable objective analysis, should provoke a significant emotional response, suggesting that such apparently disproportionate emotional neutrality would represent an important diagnostic sign of possible specific karmic anesthesia operating precisely in that particular area of experience being carefully avoided through this subtle psychological mechanism. The dimension of wanting, the third and final fundamental faculty being discussed, would hide specific karmic truth through that even more subtle mechanism that Steiner would call disguised volitional paralysis, a process where a specific person would develop an elaborate series of apparently legitimate and reasonable practical obstacles that would consistently prevent the performance of action necessary to confront the karmic material being avoided, without a specific person ever needing to consciously recognize that such obstacles would, in fact, represent a manifestation of that unconscious will itself actively working to preserve the protective status quo. Maybe you are not trapped because the world has placed limits in front of you. Maybe there's a part of you that still insists on staying where everything seems safe. Rudolf Steiner believed that some of life's biggest blocks don't come from outside. They are born within consciousness itself and are repeated until they are recognized. The question is, how many opportunities have you missed without noticing this pattern? If you want to deepen this reflection, material is in the link in the description and in the pinned comment. Steiner would also discuss how that disguised volitional paralysis would operate through that characteristic pattern whereby a specific person would find, with truly impressive creativity, ever new reasons, a legitimate practice to postpone specific necessary action, suggesting that a consistent pattern of multiple different and apparently unrelated reasons, all converging on the same result of continued avoidance, would represent a particularly revealing diagnostic sign about the active operation of this same volitional paralysis being carefully disguised through that apparent practical legitimacy being presented. The question of how these three distinct mechanisms, intellectual rationalization, emotional anesthesia, and volitional paralysis, would work together in a synchronized manner to create a truly sophisticated system of karmic concealment also received detailed systemic elaboration in Steiner's more advanced psychological teachings about this complex inner architecture being articulated. He would explain that these three mechanisms would not operate in isolation, but would rather form an integrated, mutually reinforcing system where an intellectual rationalization would provide apparent justification, emotional anesthesia would prevent discomfort that could motivate change, and volitional paralysis would ensure that even if thought and feeling eventually revealed karmic truth, transformative action would still remain effectively blocked through this truly sophisticated defensive system. Steiner would also explore how the physical body itself would actively participate in the same system of concealment through specific somatic manifestations, including chronic muscular tension in particular bodily regions, shallow and restricted breathing patterns, or even recurrent physical symptoms without a clearly identifiable medical cause, suggesting that the physical body would function, in some important sense, as an additional somatic archive, where karmic material being consciously avoided would find expression through that more primitive and less easily rationalized body language, through those intellectual mechanisms already discussed. The relationship between this specific bodily manifestation and that practice of conscious bodywork itself, including that eurythmy already mentioned extensively in other contexts related to this broader esoteric tradition, also merited careful additional therapeutic elaboration in Steiner's practical teachings on specific methods for accessing karmic material through this alternative bodily gateway, when those intellectual and emotional mechanisms would remain particularly resistant to direct recognition. He would suggest that regular practice involving conscious bodily attention and expressive movement could gradually reveal, through that same somatic language being described, important clues about the specific location and general nature of that karmic material being carefully protected through other, more conventional mechanisms. Steiner would also discuss how that night dream itself, a universal phenomenon of common human experience, but rarely understood in its true spiritual depth, would represent a particularly valuable additional door to access that same karmic material being concealed during waking consciousness through those sophisticated mechanisms already described extensively. He would explain that during sleep, especially during those specific periods of deeper sleep, where conscious personality would significantly relax those habitual psychological defenses, previously blocked karmic material could emerge through specific dream symbolism, although often disguised through that same elaborate symbolic language that would require careful and spiritually informed interpretation to reveal deeper meaning being communicated. The question of how a specific person could develop a more refined capacity to adequately interpret such significant dreams, relating specifically to karmic material being concealed, also received detailed methodological consideration in Steiner's dream teachings on this applied topic, and directly relevant to deeper self-knowledge. He would suggest regular practice involving immediate written recording of significant dreams, followed by careful reflection, seeking to identify not generic and universal symbolic interpretation, but rather specific personal meaning related to one's own unique biography and particular karmic patterns being gradually understood through such disciplined introspective work and consistently maintained over an extended period of time. Steiner would also explore how certain specific dream symbols, while certainly requiring personal and biographically contextualized interpretation rather than that popular generic interpretation often offered through conventional dream meaning manuals, would still demonstrate certain general patterns, and theologically significant ones relating specifically to that karmic work being discussed. He would suggest that dreams involving chase or escape would often relate to active avoidance of necessary karmic confrontation, while dreams involving discovery of hidden spaces or previously unknown doors could represent emerging process of conscious recognition about previously inaccessible karmic material finally beginning to become available for wider conscious integration. The relationship between this specific dream understanding and that very practice of nocturnal retrospection, already mentioned extensively in other related contexts, also deserved additional methodological elaboration as to how precisely these two distinct practices could complement each other within that broader work of karmic unconcealment being articulated through this central teaching. Steiner would explain that nightly retrospection, performed consciously before falling asleep, would create precisely that intention and appropriate psychological openness that would make subsequent emergence of meaningful dreams related specifically to karmic material being worked on more likely, suggesting important synergy between these two complementary practices when performed consistently in conjunction over time. Steiner would also discuss how that very phenomenon of therapeutic resistance, widely recognized even through that more materialistic conventional psychology, but rarely understood in its true spiritual and karmic dimension, would represent a direct and particularly significant manifestation of that entire system of sophisticated concealment already described extensively through this teaching. He would explain that that specific resistance, often observed when conventional therapeutic process approaches emotionally significant territory, would represent precisely that tripartite defensive system rationalization, anesthesia, and paralysis, actively and simultaneously mobilizing to protect specific karmic material being threatened by an overly direct and potentially destabilizing therapeutic approach without corresponding adequate spiritual preparation. The question of how a therapist adequately informed about this specific karmic dimension could work most effectively with such resistance, recognizing it not as a merely problematic obstacle to be overcome through force or therapeutic insistence, but rather as important diagnostic information about proximity to particularly significant material, also received detailed therapeutic consideration in Steiner's clinical teachings on this more sophisticated approach. He would suggest that the therapist should learn precisely to honor and respect such resistance, perhaps slowing down the therapeutic process precisely at those moments where resistance would manifest itself most intensely, allowing the specific person to gradually develop, at their own appropriate pace, that same capacity and readiness necessary for eventual more direct confrontation with karmic material being carefully protected through that sophisticated defensive system. Steiner would also explore how that very phenomenon of therapeutic transference, a concept that would gain significant importance, especially through that later development of psychoanalysis through Sigmund Freud and subsequent followers, would also represent an additional and particularly interesting manifestation of that same karmic dynamic being discussed through this broader esoteric teaching. He would suggest that specific relationship patterns that a specific person would develop, perhaps unconsciously, with a particular therapeutic figure would often reflect, in a symbolically significant way, those same deeper karmic patterns being worked through, thus offering valuable additional diagnostic information when understood through this broader esoteric lens, complementing that purely conventional psychoanalytic understanding. The relationship between this understanding of therapeutic transference and Steiner's own broader doctrine of karmic connections between specific people, already discussed extensively in another previously related context, also merited careful additional elaboration on how precisely these conceptual elements would connect within this broader karmic framework being articulated. He would explain that a specific therapeutic relationship, even when relatively recent and professionally structured, could occasionally also represent a manifestation of that same deeper karmic connection developed through previous encounters in specific past lives, suggesting that specific therapist and patient could be in some important sense, continuing mutual karmic work begun long before that present therapeutic relationship was consciously established. Steiner would also discuss how that very specific moment of genuine therapeutic insight, that dramatic moment often described through language related to sudden revelation or even significant cathartic experience, would represent precisely that crucial point where that already extensively described tripartite defensive system would temporarily collapse, allowing direct and immediately experiential access to that karmic material, previously protected through rationalization, anesthesia, and volitional paralysis, being simultaneously suspended during that particular moment of deeper spiritual and psychological clarity. The question of how a specific person could prepare more actively and consciously to facilitate the emergence of such moments of genuine insight without that counterproductive attempt to artificially force such an experience before appropriate spiritual preparation was adequately developed also received careful methodological consideration in Steiner's practical teachings on this delicate and potentially risky topic when inadequately approached. He would suggest that consistent practice involving that specific combination of nocturnal retrospection, conscious bodily attention, careful dream recording, and gradual development of that capacity to recognize one's own patterns of rationalization, anesthesia, and volitional paralysis would represent a safer and more sustainable preparatory path, creating gradually more conducive conditions for the eventual spontaneous and appropriately timed emergence of that transformative insight being described. Steiner would also explore how that broader social and cultural environment itself, including particularly those dominant cultural messages relating to constant productivity and socially valued emotional suppression, could inadvertently reinforce and even intensify that individual karmic defensive system already described extensively throughout this teaching. He would suggest that specific modern Western culture, with its often excessive emphasis on cold, emotionally disconnected rationality, could offer problematic cultural reinforcement for precisely that sophisticated rationalization already discussed. While that social expectation about constant maintenance of positive and controlled emotional appearance could similarly reinforce that selective emotional anesthesia being worked through this process of deeper self-knowledge. The relationship between this specific cultural critique and one's own individual responsibility for developing a more spiritually informed and emotionally honest culture also merited additional social consideration in Steiner's communal teachings on this broader topic. He would suggest that a specific person working consciously with their own individual karmic concealment system would simultaneously, and through that same personal work, contribute to broader cultural transformation, gradually creating, through authentic and increasingly less defensive personal example, an alternative model of greater emotional and spiritual honesty that could eventually positively influence that broader social and cultural environment being critiqued through this comprehensive esoteric analysis. Steiner would also discuss how that very phenomenon of significant synchronicity, already mentioned briefly in another related context previously, could also function specifically as a mechanism through which that specific personal angel would attempt, through apparently coincidental but spiritually orchestrated external circumstances, to communicate an important message about the need for more conscious attention to one of those specific concealment mechanisms being discussed. He would suggest that a specific person finding himself repeatedly confronted, through seemingly random external circumstances, with situations thematically related to a particular karmic pattern being carefully avoided, should seriously consider the possibility that such a repeated pattern represents precisely that subtle but persistent spiritual guidance, ultimately trying to penetrate through that sophisticated defensive system. The question of how a specific person could develop finer discernment to properly recognize such karmically significant synchronicities, distinguishing them from mere random coincidence without such a deeper spiritual dimension, also received careful diagnostic elaboration in Steiner's perceptive teachings on this particular topic. He would suggest specific criteria, including emotional intensity, disproportionality, associated with such specific coincidences, quality of consistent thematic repetition across multiple, seemingly unrelated contexts, and even that characteristic subjective sensation of deeper recognition that would distinguish genuinely synchronistic and spiritually significant experience from that of mere statistical coincidence, without such additional dimension being properly considered through this more sophisticated discriminative process. Steiner would also explore how that very process of natural aging, often accompanied by a gradual increase in that biographical wisdom and broader perspective on one's complete life journey, could naturally facilitate, even without specific conscious spiritual work, a degree of spontaneous karmic unconcealment, as those more rigid psychological defenses characteristic of youth would gradually become more flexible and permeable through that natural process of broader psychological and spiritual maturation accompanying the passage of biographical time. He would suggest that a specific older person would often demonstrate a greater natural ability to recognize and even openly discuss their own past patterns of self-sabotage, suggesting that advanced age could paradoxically offer a certain natural spiritual advantage to the specific work of karmic unconcealment being described. The relationship between this natural process of aging and that very responsibility for more consciously and intentionally directed spiritual work also deserved additional balanced consideration in Steiner's teachings on how these two processes, natural and intentional, could complement each other rather than a specific person simply passively awaiting that supposed natural wisdom of age without any corresponding conscious effort. He would emphasize that although the natural process of maturation would certainly offer a certain advantage, conscious and actively directed spiritual work would always remain infinitely more effective and reliable than simply passively awaiting that supposedly automatic transformation through the mere passage of biographical time without any appropriate conscious intervention. A truly sophisticated and systemically integrated understanding of this complex doctrine about hidden mechanisms of karmic self-sabotage from that specific tripartite architecture involving thinking, feeling, and willing to extensive practical implications for therapeutic work, dream interpretation, and even broader cultural critique, would thus offer genuinely sophisticated and clinically applicable perspective on how that sophisticated defensive system protecting specific karmic material could be gradually understood, respected, and eventually transformed through conscious and disciplined work, inviting anyone interested in this deep, esoteric exploration to recognize, with appropriate humility and genuine curiosity, one's own specific mechanisms of intellectual rationalization, emotional anesthesia, and volitional paralysis, thus beginning that truly transformative work of conscious unconcealment that would make it possible, finally, to stop hiding from those deeper karmic truths that such a sophisticated defensive system would have worked so diligently to keep protected through mechanisms that, while certainly impressive in their own psychological sophistication, could never manage to remain completely impenetrable to that same spiritual consciousness, willing to work patiently and persistently toward that deeper and genuinely liberating recognition of one's essential karmic nature. Steiner would also discuss in detail how that very phenomenon of productive procrastination, distinct from that conventional procrastination already potentially discussed in other related contexts, would represent a particularly sophisticated and often unrecognized manifestation of that system of karmic concealment being articulated through this broader teaching. He would explain that a specific person could develop a characteristic pattern where he or she would remain extremely busy and productive in multiple tangential or even genuinely important areas of one's life, precisely as a sophisticated way of avoiding that specific area most directly related to karmic material being carefully protected, thus creating a convincing illusion of full and meaningful life, while simultaneously, the more essential karmic work would remain indefinitely postponed through that same apparently legitimate productivity being used as an additional defensive mechanism. The question of how a specific person could differentiate between genuine productivity, mind meaningful and aligned with broader spiritual purpose, versus that productivity specifically being utilized as a sophisticated karmic avoidance mechanism, also received careful diagnostic consideration in Steiner's practical teachings. On this particular and often confusing topic for many people actively working on their own spiritual development, it would suggest conscious reflection on whether a specific activity, even when objectively productive and valuable, was being chosen and prioritized precisely because it would offer convenient distraction from that most uncomfortable area deserving more direct attention, suggesting that a subjective feeling of specific relief when diving into a particular tangential activity, especially when such relief would directly relate to simultaneous avoidance of the most uncomfortable area, would represent an important diagnostic sign about the operation of the productive procrastination being described. Steiner would also explore how that very phenomenon of compensatory spirituality, a particularly ironic but significantly common pattern among people genuinely interested in spiritual development, would represent another sophisticated manifestation of that same defensive system being articulated through this central teaching. He would explain that a specific person could develop a pattern where they would significantly intensify spiritual practice in more comfortable and less directly confronting areas, perhaps through extensive theoretical study or even technically sophisticated meditative practice, precisely as a way of avoiding that more difficult and emotionally challenging work, specifically related to more personal and potentially shameful karmic material being carefully protected through that same compensatory spirituality being practiced extensively. The relationship between this specific compensatory spirituality and that very critique that Steiner would already develop in another related context against hasty and inadequately prepared attempts to confront the threshold guardian also merited careful additional elaboration on how these two seemingly opposing phenomena, overly cautious spirituality versus hasty spirituality, could both represent, ironically, distinct manifestations of that same karmic system of avoidance being discussed through this more comprehensive teaching. He would explain that either a specific person completely avoiding deeper spiritual work through that compensatory spirituality, or a specific person hastily trying to force premature confrontation with deeper karmic material, could ultimately be avoiding that more gradual, patient, and genuinely transformative work that authentic karmic process would typically require. Steiner would also discuss how that very phenomenon of preventive catastrophizing, a particularly interesting psychological pattern where a specific person would in advance imagine extremely negative and devastating scenarios related to possible karmic confrontation, would represent an additional and particularly effective mechanism for reinforcing that volitional paralysis already discussed extensively through this central teaching. He would suggest that such specific catastrophizing would work precisely by creating anticipatory terror so intense that any actual movement toward that necessary karmic work would appear, through this distorted lens, dangerous and even potentially devastating. When in reality, according to the more balanced esoteric articulation that Steiner would consistently offer, a properly prepared process of karmic confrontation would represent certainly challenging experience, but rarely catastrophic in the extreme way being imagined through this specific defensive mechanism. The question of how a specific person could consciously work to neutralize that specific preventative catastrophizing also received detailed therapeutic consideration in Steiner's practical teachings on this applied topic, and directly relevant to overcoming paralyzing fear related to deeper spiritual work. He would suggest conscious practice involving careful, rational questioning about actual evidence, supporting those specific catastrophic scenarios being imagined, combined with conscious recollection about past experiences where confrontation with significant challenge, although certainly uncomfortable, would not result in that complete devastation originally feared, suggesting that gradual development of this capacity for more realistic and balanced assessment would represent an important antidote to that preemptive catastrophizing being worked through this specific therapeutic process. Steiner would also explore how that pheno itself, less than excessive identification with a specific social role, including that tendency to define oneself rigidly through a particular profession, a specific family role, or even a particularly rigid religious or political identity, could function as an additional and especially sophisticated mechanism for avoiding confrontation with karmic material that could, in some way, threaten or contradict that carefully constructed and defended social identity. He would explain that specific person could unconsciously avoid any recognition or exploration of karmic material that would seem incompatible with that rigidly held social self-image, thus creating that same defensive structure where identity flexibility necessary for genuine spiritual growth would remain blocked through that excessively rigid social identification being maintained. The relationship between this specific pattern of rigid social identification and that very human capacity for broader and more flexible spiritual identity, transcending those more limited conventional social categories, also merited careful additional philosophical elaboration in Steiner's identity teachings on this theme fundamental to all of his broader work on human spiritual development. He would explain that increasing recognition of one's most essential spiritual identity, that same higher self already discussed extensively in other contexts related to this more comprehensive anthroposophical cosmology, would offer precisely that more secure and stable basis that would eventually make possible greater flexibility and openness to recognizing potentially challenging karmic material without that same existential threat that rigid and limited social identification would inevitably experience in the face of such expanded recognition. Steiner would also discuss how that very phenomenon of constant social comparison, an extremely common psychological pattern, especially throughout that contemporary culture, increasingly saturated by digital exposure to the apparently perfect lives of other people, would represent a particularly modern and relevant additional mechanism for reinforcing that system of karmic concealment being discussed. He would suggest that a specific person compulsively engaging in constant and unfavorable social comparison would, often without adequate conscious recognition, be using such comparison as an elaborate and emotionally engaging distraction that would prevent more direct and necessary attention to one's own inner karmic work, replacing that genuine work with constant external preoccupation with relative status and comparative social validation. The question of how a specific person could consciously work to reduce that compulsive social comparison and more appropriately redirect attention to necessary inner karmic work also received additional practical consideration in Steiner's contemporaneously relevant teachings on this particular topic. He would suggest conscious practice involving deliberate reduction of exposure to digital content, specifically triggering that problematic social comparison, combined with intentional cultivation of that deeper inner attention through regular contemplative practices already discussed extensively, suggesting that conscious redirection of psychological energy previously devoted to external comparison would represent additional valuable resource available for that more significant inner karmic work being prioritized through this conscious shift of attentional focus. Steiner would also explore how that very phenomenon of defensive humor, a pattern where a specific person would consistently use humor or irony precisely in those moments where an emotionally significant and potentially karmic topic was being addressed, would represent an additional sophisticated and socially accepted mechanism for diverting attention, both their own and that of others present, from that deeper material being carefully avoided through the same humorous strategy being consistently employed. He would explain that although genuine humor would certainly represent a valuable and even spiritually significant human quality when appropriately used, that humor that is specifically defensive and consistently triggered by proximity to uncomfortable emotional territory would represent a distinct and diagnostically significant pattern deserving recognition and appropriate conscious work. The relationship between this specific defensive humor and that very human capacity for genuine, spiritually balanced humor also deserved careful additional elaboration on how precisely to differentiate these two related but distinct phenomena within that broader understanding being articulated through this central teaching. Steiner would suggest that genuine humor would emerge spontaneously and contribute to deeper connection and even healthy emotional processing of shared experience, while specific defensive humor would function precisely to create distance and avoid that same emotional or spiritual depth that particular situation might otherwise naturally invite, suggesting that careful attention to the specific function being fulfilled by particular humor at specific time would offer important diagnostic insight into which of these two patterns would actually be operating through the humorous behavior being considered. Steiner would also discuss how that very phenomenon of compulsive altruism, a pattern where a specific person would devote excessive attention and energy to caring for other people's needs and problems, precisely as a way of avoiding more direct attention to one's own karmic needs and personal spiritual development, would represent a particularly complex and morally ambiguous additional manifestation of that defensive system being articulated through this broader teaching. He would explain that although genuine care for other people would certainly represent an important spiritual virtue and even a crucial element of that capacity for Christological love, already discussed extensively in another previously related context, that specifically compulsive and disproportionately focused altruism on external needs, at the expense of systematic neglect for one's own necessary personal spiritual development, would represent a distinct and potentially problematic pattern deserving careful recognition and appropriate conscious work. The question of how a specific person could develop finer discernment to differentiate between genuine, spiritually balanced service versus that compulsive altruism specifically being used as a karmic avoidance mechanism also received additional ethical and practical consideration in Steiner's teachings on this particularly subtle and morally complex topic. He would suggest conscious reflection on whether specific care being offered to other people would arise from a genuinely abundant and spiritually nourished inner place, versus arising from a compulsive need to avoid through constant occupation with external problems, that emptiness or inner discomfort related specifically to personal karmic material being carefully avoided through this same excessive altruistic dedication. Steiner would also explore how that very work of developing this broader discriminative capacity, allowing for more precise recognition between multiple specific manifestations of that karmic system of concealment being described through this comprehensive teaching, would necessarily require parallel development of that same quality of radical self-honesty that he would already discuss as a crucial element in other contexts related to this broader esoteric tradition. He would suggest that a specific person genuinely committed to this work of deeper self-knowledge would need to cultivate a consistent willingness to question one's motivations, even when such questioning would reveal uncomfortable information about one's own specific defensive mechanisms, being gradually recognized and worked through this broader therapeutic and spiritual process. The relationship between all this sophisticated understanding about multiple specific manifestations of that karmic system of occultation and that broader spiritual journey itself related to the development of those 12 senses already discussed extensively in another previously related context also deserved careful conclusive synthesis about how these different conceptual elements would fundamentally connect within that more comprehensive anthroposophical cosmology being articulated throughout Steiner's esoteric work. He would explain that the gradual development of that specific sense of self, the highest capacity previously discussed relating to direct perception of the essential spiritual individuality of both one's own and others, would represent precisely that culminating capacity which would make possible clearer and more direct recognition of all those sophisticated mechanisms of karmic concealment being described through this broader and more comprehensive teaching. Steiner would also discuss how that very gradual process of integration between development of this more refined sense of self and simultaneous recognition of those multiple mechanisms of concealment already described would represent a genuinely sophisticated spiritual journey requiring considerable patience and consistent work over an extended period of time. He would explain what person-specific work should not expect instantaneous and complete recognition of all those defensive mechanisms being simultaneously operative, but rather should approach such work through that same quality of gradual and carefully structured investigation that would characterize all broader anthroposophical methodology being developed systematically through decades of disciplined and consistently maintained practice. The question of how a specific person could adequately assess his or her progress through this complex and multifaceted work without falling into that same trap of excessive self-criticism or unrealistic expectations about rapid transformation also received careful practical consideration in Steiner's teachings on gradual spiritual development on this particular topic. He would suggest that a more reliable indicator of genuine progress would involve not the complete absence of those specific defensive mechanisms, but rather the development of a qualitatively different relationship with such mechanisms when they inevitably manifest themselves, characterized by quicker recognition and less emotional resistance to admitting their presence, rather than that automatic and unconscious denial that would characterize the earlier, less developed stage of that same spiritual work being gradually deepened. Steiner would also explore how that group work itself, including participation in a spiritual community structured appropriately for such a specific purpose, could offer a particularly valuable additional resource for this complex work of mutual recognition of those sophisticated mechanisms of concealment being discussed. He would suggest that people working together within that safe and mutually respectful community context could, through carefully structured and compassionate observation, help identify specific mechanisms operating in other people that those same people, because of precisely that sophisticated and self-deceiving nature of those mechanisms, might have significant difficulty recognizing through isolated reflection and not benefiting from that compassionate external perspective being offered through that community work. The relationship between this specific community work and that very need for appropriate discernment about when and how to offer such compassionate observation to others without that inappropriate or even harmful imposition, already warned about in another previously related context, also deserved careful additional ethical elaboration in Steiner's teachings on spiritual community on this sensitive topic. He would emphasize the importance of always obtaining appropriate consent and respecting personal autonomy before offering such a specific observation, suggesting that more effective spiritual community would function through that same structure where such compassionate feedback would be explicitly requested and mutually agreed upon, rather than unilaterally imposed without appropriate consideration for the specific person's genuine readiness and willingness to receive such a potentially challenging observation. There is a difference between facing a challenge and escape from it using justifications that seem perfectly reasonable. According to Rudolf Steiner, this is precisely where many karmic processes remain active, because what conscience avoids today, life usually presents itself again tomorrow. If you want to understand why these cycles repeat themselves, I left additional content in the description link and also in the pinned comment. Steiner would also discuss how that very moment of recognition of a specific mechanism of karmic concealment, even when achieved through such carefully structured community work or even through more isolated individual work, would represent only the beginning of that broader process of genuine transformation, requiring additional and consistent work to effectively integrate such recognition into more lasting and significant behavioral and spiritual change. He would suggest that a specific person should not confuse a moment of intellectual insight into a particular mechanism with that complete and definitive transformation, but rather understand such insight as a crucial first step within that more extensive process of practical and consistently maintained work necessary for genuine and sustainable change over time. The question of how a specific person could maintain consistent motivation and commitment through that longer and sometimes challenging process of practical integration, especially during those inevitable times when progress would seem slow or even temporarily stagnant, also received additional motivational consideration in Steiner's practical teachings on the sustainability of this long-term spiritual work. He would suggest regular practice involving conscious recognition and appropriate celebration of those specific small advances being made, even when seemingly modest when compared with that complete transformation eventually being sought, suggesting that such regular recognition of incremental progress would represent an important motivational resource for sustaining that longer and more demanding work over time necessary for genuine and lasting transformation. Steiner would also explore how that very common experience related to relapse or temporary return to previous patterns of karmic concealment, a practically universal and expected phenomenon within this process of genuine transformation, should be understood not as definitive failure or evidence of complete failure of that work being done, but rather as a normal and even informative part of that broader and more complex process of genuine spiritual change. He would suggest that the specific person experiencing such a relapse should approach it with that same quality of compassionate curiosity and careful investigation, rather than harsh self-criticism, seeking to understand specifically what particular circumstances or triggers would have contributed to the temporary reactivation of that specific defensive mechanism being worked on, thereby transforming the relapse experience into an additional opportunity for more precise learning and refinement of that broader therapeutic and spiritual work. The relationship between this understanding of relapse as valuable information and that very capacity for self-compassion already discussed briefly in another previously related context also merited careful final synthesis on how these elements would connect within this broader journey of karmic transformation being articulated throughout this comprehensive teaching. Steiner would emphasize that the appropriate combination of honest and rigorous investigation into one's own specific mechanisms of karmic concealment and that same quality of genuine compassion for oneself throughout this challenging process would ultimately represent the most sustainable and genuinely transformative approach to this complex and multifaceted work being described throughout this esoteric exploration into the occult psychology of karmic self-sabotage. The truly sophisticated and clinically applicable understanding of this rich doctrine about multiple specific and often unrecognized manifestations of that karmic system of concealment, from productive procrastination and compensatory spirituality to compulsive altruism and defensive mood, from appropriately structured community work to sustainable integration over time, would thus offer genuinely comprehensive and practically enlightening perspective on how that extraordinarily sophisticated defensive system, protecting specific karmic material, could be gradually, patiently, and compassionately understood and transformed, inviting anyone interested in such exploration. Deeper esotericism to approach one's own work of self-knowledge with that essential combination of rigorous honesty and genuine compassion, recognizing that the process of finally stopping hiding would represent not a single dramatic event, but rather an ongoing and progressively more conscious journey of recognizing, understanding, and gradually transforming those same sophisticated mechanisms that for so long would have protected, with truly impressive creativity, exactly that karmic material that would ultimately need to be consciously integrated to make possible that genuinely different and more authentic life that would always remain available to any human soul willing to undertake with increasing patience and courage, this deeply transformative and cosmically significant spiritual work. Steiner would emphasize, in concluding this particularly sophisticated and clinically detailed exploration into the complex inner architecture of that system of karmic concealment, that the ultimate purpose of this specific esoteric understanding would never involve a mere fascinating cataloging of diverse psychological mechanisms, but rather a practically applicable and genuinely transformative tool for anyone recognizing, with appropriate humility, their own specific patterns of rationalization, anesthesia, paralysis, and their multiple additional sophisticated manifestations being carefully described through this comprehensive teaching. What if the biggest enemy of your evolution wasn't someone else, but the version of yourself that has learned to hide behind fear, doubt, or accommodation? Maybe that's why some people completely change their lives when they identify the pattern that kept them stuck. Rudolf Steiner saw this recognition as one of the most important steps before the inner transformation. If this idea has stuck in your mind, it's worth checking out the material available at the link in the description and in the pinned comment. This final guidance on practical application and genuine transformation would represent, according to the conclusive synthesis offered throughout this detailed esoteric exploration, a particularly significant contribution that Rudolf Steiner would offer specifically to anyone interested in understanding, with increasing sophistication and genuine compassion, those profoundly subtle mechanisms that his own psyche would have developed to temporarily protect him from that necessary confrontation with deeper karmic truth, thus offering not only a more refined intellectual understanding, but also a practical and genuinely traversable path towards that truly transformative freedom that would become possible precisely when the defensive system, finally understood and respectfully worked through, would gradually give way to more direct and authentic recognition of who a specific person genuinely was.